In October of 2012, 6-year-old Lucia Krim and 2-year-old Leo Krim were living with their parents, Marina and Kevin, at the La Rochelle apartment building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The Krims had moved to New York from San Francisco in 2010 after Kevin found work as a digital content executive at the television network CNBC. On the other hand, Marina Krim was a former kindergarten teacher turned stay-at-home mother who occupied herself by teaching art and chronicling her children's lives through a series of video blogs. There's no doubt that Marina was a dedicated mother, but she couldn't be there for all her children and all the time. And this is where Yoselin Ortega enters the picture. Originally from Santiago de los Caballeros in the Dominican Republic, Ortega was a 50-year-old naturalized U.S. citizen during October of 2012. She resided on Riverside Drive in Manhattan's Hamilton Heights, along with her 17-year-old son Jesus, her sister, and her niece. And to support them, she gained employment as the Krims family babysitter for $18 an hour. By October of 2012, Ortega had been the Krims family babysitter for almost 2 years and had earned the trust of both Marina and her husband. So much so that Marina trusted her to take her 6-year-old Lulu to her ballet lessons. One of their usual routines was that while Ortega took Lulu to her ballet lessons, Marina would accompany 3-year-old Nessie to the girls' swimming lessons at the nearby YMCA. After Lulu's ballet lesson was over, Marina was to bring Nessa to the ballet venue, meet Ortega, and they would all make their way back to the Krims' apartment together to have dinner. Yet on October 25th of 2012, when Marina arrived at the ballet venue to meet Ortega, she discovered that neither Lulu or her babysitter had arrived for the ballet lesson. Confused, Marina headed back to the La Rochelle apartment, assuming that Lulu was feeling unwell and that there was some other legitimate reason for her failing to attend the lesson. Yet when she arrived home, she walked into every parent's worst nightmare. She expected the apartment to be occupied, and for a concerned Ortega to rush to her with an explanation why Lulu failed to attend her ballet lesson. Yet as Marina walked inside, the lights were off, almost as if there was no one home. Marina called out for her children, and then called out for Ortega, but there was no reply, so instead of actually investigating the remainder of the apartment, she went back downstairs to the building's doorman to inquire about her children. Upon being questioned, it was the doorman's turn to express confusion. He had seen Yoselin Ortega as she and the children had stepped into the building's elevator just a few hours before. To his knowledge, they hadn't left the building either, not by the front entrance anyway, so there was no reason why they shouldn't still be inside the Krims' apartment. Marina began to realize that something was wrong, but the extent of the horror that awaited her was something she could have never expected. Marina returned to the apartment to search high and low for any sign of her children and their babysitter. Then when she arrived in one of the family's bathrooms, she let out a blood-curdling scream that was thick with grief. Lying in the bathtub, in a pool of their own blood, were the lifeless corpse of 2-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Lulu. It was a sight that just about anyone would have found sickeningly horrifying, but for a mother to witness her own children in such a state, it was enough to drive Marina to madness. Yet the horror wasn't over, not by a long shot. Kneeling next to the bathtub, the bloody knife still in her grip, was Yoselin Ortega. She had been in what amounted to a catatonic state until Marina had walked into the bathroom, but the grief-stricken mother's scream dragged Yoselin out of her trance, with the reality of her actions hitting her with all the force of a runaway freight train. Yoselin looked up at Marina, then down at the children. Then after unleashing a banshee's scream of her own, she jammed the knife into one of her wrists and began sawing up her own forearm. Before Marina could even react to what Yoselin was doing, the once loyal babysitter brought the knife up to her throat and opened it up with a deep slash that left blood streaming down her chest. Thankfully, Marina was being accompanied by the apartment building superintendent, who promptly contacted emergency services when he realized what was happening. It was far too late to save the children, but the EMTs were able to stabilize the gruesome injuries that Jocelyn Ortega had inflicted on herself, saving her life to ensure that she would stand trial for the demonic crimes she had committed. Kevin Krim, the children's father, didn't learn of their deaths until that evening, when he returned from a business trip that had taken him back to San Francisco, and to say he was devastated would amount to the understatement of the century. Once she was physically well enough to be questioned, Ortega was alarmingly forthcoming with her motive for murdering the children. She claimed that she was deeply upset that the Krims had rejected her request for more working hours, and that she desperately needed the money, and that their refusal was tantamount to a death sentence for her. However, the Krims claimed that they had not actually refused to pay her more money, and had instead offered Ortega a pay raise if she started doing housework for them during her nannying hours. Indeed, Ortega's own family seemed to dismiss the idea that denying her a raise was the motive for the murders, as she was treated very well by the Krim family. On one occasion, the Krims paid for Ortega's plane tickets to see her family in the Dominican Republic, and in another instance had joined her on vacation there. She was also said to be extremely close to Lulu and Leo, and that the trio had a deeply loving and affectionate relationship as a result of almost 2 years of near-constant companionship. This led to investigators theorizing that Ortega may have suffered some kind of manic episode, as surely no sane person in her position would have been able to inflict such hideous violence on 2 innocent children. It was argued that evidence of such a manic or dissociative episode was how Ortega seemed to snap back to reality upon hearing Marina Krim's screams. Investigators argued that once she realized what she'd done, attempting to take her own life was the only viable solution to her. After heavy psychoanalysis at a New York City psychiatric hospital, Jocelyn was later found mentally competent to stand trial for the murders of 2-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Lulu. Yet it would take 5 long years to take her to trial. During that time, Ortega would make over 90 separate court appearances. She opted for a psychiatric defense, claiming she had no memory of the murders and could not explain what happened that afternoon which led to the deaths of the children. Therefore, it seemed perfectly reasonable to her to plead not guilty to the counts of first-degree murder and to reject a number of plea deals that would have resulted in lesser sentences than life in prison. Finally, on May 14th of 2018, Jocelyn Ortega was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In his final ruling, the presiding judge labeled her as pure evil and dismissed her claims that she wasn't responsible for her behavior. In the aftermath of the children's murder, the New York State Assembly and State Senate passed the Lucia and Leo's Law. The first of its kind in the entire U.S., the Lulu and Leo's Law made it a criminal offense to deliberately misrepresent the mental health of a person applying to work as a child caregiver. No such legislation will bring Leo or Lulu back from the dead, but we can always hope that it might deter such things from happening in the future. Yet following their murders, the big question that seems to linger is, what exactly drove Jocelyn Ortega to kill 2 children she had come to love so deeply? While it may seem like a compelling argument that her mental health was to blame, Ortega had absolutely no history of anxiety or depression aside from a few familial anecdotes. It seems clear to most that the psychiatric defense was simply her attorney's last best hope to land her a reduced sentence. After all, she had been their babysitter for 2 years with 0 complaints regarding her behavior, and she had become a trusted member of the Krim's family circle by the time of the murders. Jocelyn herself claims she has no memory of the murders, and while this might seem like an awfully convenient aspect of her psychological defense, we can't rule out that she experienced some kind of blackout and committed the murders while in some dissociative state. But then, what else would cause such a blackout? Medical professionals ruled that Jocelyn had no kind of ongoing psychological condition at the time of her arrest. But what if she's telling the truth about not remembering the murders? What if something that medical science isn't quite ready to explain yet took Jocelyn over? Of course, Such a theory might sound like the stuff of fiction, but there was a time in recent history when the idea that tiny microscopic life forms were responsible for causing disease was dismissed by those who saw themselves as the educated elite. Perhaps in time, Jocelyn's behavior will be explained by something deemed chilling but feasible, when at the present time, such a concept is too terrifying to even contemplate.
An 11-year-old child should never know the trauma of what occurred 7 Septembers ago. It was one day before spooky season, September 30th. I was babysitting my best friend's child, Dominic. I called him Dommy. I knew Dommy his whole life. I was even at the hospital when he was born. He called me Aunt Claire, short for Clarissa. I kept him once before, but it was short-lived. He was struck with a stomach bug, and I ended up taking him home. This time though, Dommy was healthier and happier than ever, excited to stay with me. I lived in a small cottage-style home with 3 bedrooms. It was located at the end of a spacey cul-de-sac, giving me the privacy that I craved. Behind my house, beyond the wooden fence, was hundreds of acres of wooded area, making for quiet nights. Back then, I really loved quiet nights. I remember the smell of spaghetti as Dommy wolfed down 2 big bowls. I was really surprised at how much he ate. I was really proud that he loved my cooking and even sent a boastful text to his mom. He settled down in his pajamas and curled up on the couch. It was about 9 p.m. when I sat next to him. I was a part-time student with a full-time job, so I was really exhausted. I looked at Dommy and I asked, "Well, is it time for bed yet?" "Maybe for you," he responded in a sassy, playful voice. I had a real sweet spot for Dommy, and I still do. I allowed him to stay up a little bit longer, but I told him to be in bed by 10:30. He agreed, and he continued watching his show. Shortly after, I went to my room and cracked the door. As tired as I was, I probably fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. I remember having a bad dream before Dommy woke me up by shaking my bed. He then let out an aggressive whisper, "Aunt Claire, wake up." I was startled so badly that I let out a yelp. "Yeah, baby, what's wrong?" I asked. I'm hungry," he said. He sounded strange, almost like he was frightened. "Hungry?" I asked. "You ate 2 big bowls of spaghetti." "I know." He paused and looked at me with frightened eyes. "I want more." Looking back, I'm really ashamed to say that I was upset with him and that I took an angry tone. No, I'm not a morning person, and certainly not a wake me up in the middle of night person. "Dommy, it's nearly midnight. You promised to be in bed. Call it a night and I'll make you some breakfast in the morning." I jerked the blankets and then rolled over, shutting my eyes. Not 10 seconds passed before he shook the bed again, whispering, "I really need a bowl of spaghetti. Right now." I turned over, not believing how difficult he was being. He had never misbehaved like this and was always polite. I stared at him in disbelief. "Fine," I said, crawling out of bed. I walked with him through the dark house to the kitchen. Before we could make it to the fridge, he grabbed my wrist. He stared at me with tears in his eyes. His little body trembled and squatted down. "What's wrong, Dommy?" And he then whispered something that shook my core. "There's a man in your bedroom. He's under your bed." "What? No," I said in disbelief. "No one's under my bed." "There is. I don't want him to know that I know. I had to get you in here." As Dommy finished his sentence, we then heard a rustling down the hallway, the noise coming from my room. We were both paralyzed in fear. We had no idea what to do. Dommy began crying, which boosted me into action. I scooped him up and unlocked the back door. I jetted and entered the pitch-black backyard. Once I was out there, holding Dommy, my heart dropped as I came to a realization. My cell phone was on the dresser, next to my bed. As quickly as I could, I then ran with Dami right through a side gate and into the front yard. I stubbed my toe on something. I can still remember how terribly it hurt, but I kept moving. I saw my destination down the street, my closest neighbor. Their garage door was open, and I saw the silhouette of a man inside of it. It was the longest, most terrifying run of my life. There was nothing but blackness around me as my bare feet ran on the pavement. I almost expected to be tackled by the intruder that was inside my house, but I wasn't. I made it to my neighbor's house and called the police. The police came, lights and sirens. They checked inside my house, but they didn't find the intruder. They did, however, find that my bedroom window was wide open. The strange man likely fled into the woods after hearing Dami and I's conversation. To this day, I don't know who was under my bed or how or when they got there. For a really long time, I convinced myself that it was my crazy ex-boyfriend Drew from a few years back. But I changed my mind after running into Drew at an Olive Garden, where he then introduced me to his wife. I dream of different endings to my experience. Oftentimes I wake up in a trembling sweat because Dami and I were killed violently. I don't sleep much anymore. Dami's mom and I aren't as close as we used to be. We only text when I ask how Dami's doing. She says that Dami still loves me, but he'll never ever stay with me again. And I can't say I blame him.
I've never been a babysitter, unless you count looking after my little brother on the odd occasion, but I do have a babysitter story for you all. This all happened back when I was about 10 or 11, as it was the last year of primary school for me, and I remember being really excited about going to big school, as my mom and dad phrased it. They were off to some work function, and I needed a babysitter. I distinctly remember them being worried that they wouldn't be able to go, as I think they left it quite late and were worried that they wouldn't be able to find a sitter. I didn't want to be left alone with a stranger, so I remember being absolutely gutted when they said they'd managed to find someone to stay for a few hours on a Saturday evening. But when the time came and the babysitter arrived, I remember thinking that it wouldn't be so bad. She was very pretty and seemed genuinely lovely. Some university student called Sarah, I can't quite remember, but she pretty much won my parents over in the first few minutes, and well, since they liked her so much, I kind of liked her too. She told me we'd have a little slumber party, that we could watch my favorite film, and my parents sweetened the deal by saying that they'd leave us money for some pizza. So I really did perk up for a bit as they showed the girl around the house and actually warmed up to the idea as they left the house, and Sarah, who we'll just call her now for the story's sake, she began to order us pizza. Only, that's when things started to get a bit weird. She asked me what my favorite topping was, in a voice that didn't sound nearly as jolly as before. When I told her I liked pepperoni the most, still my favorite, she just laughed and told me she was a vegetarian. I tried to tell her we could always get 2 smaller pizzas, but she just ignored me as she placed an order for a large spicy veggie one. I hated spice, and I still do. I can't handle chilies for the life of me, even as a grown-up, so the younger me was absolutely heartbroken that I'd been pretty much shut out of the pizza party that we were supposed to be throwing. And it all went downhill from there. There was a knock at the door a little while after she called, and I suspected it was the delivery guy, but it wasn't. From the top of the stairs, I watched as some lad in his own clothes stepped out of the cold and into our hallway. I was confused as to what was going on, where the pizza was and all that, but when the pair of them started sharing this really horrible wet kiss, I got onto the fact that it was obviously her boyfriend or something. And this is all after hearing my parents make it clear to her that she wasn't allowed any company around. So I was really bloody annoyed at this point, like furious. So I snuck down into the kitchen to try and find the house phone to call my mom. Only it wasn't in the charger. I trot around for a wee bit trying to find the thing when I realized there's a good chance the babysitter had it with her. I walked down the hall to the living room where she and her boyfriend were, opened the door, and pretty much recoil at what I see. They're doing stuff, right there on the couch. Sarah screams at me to get out and shuts the door, and I respond with asking her for the phone. She doesn't even acknowledge my request, gets up from the couch with fury in her eyes and slams the door on me before screaming through the wood to get back up to my room and be quiet. I told her I was hungry, but again, absolutely no acknowledgement. So I went back up to my room and just bawled my eyes out. So it's pretty important to remember that this was like the mid-90s, back when the internet or mobile phones weren't exactly available or affordable for a family like mine. If this had happened nowadays, it would be a piece of pie to just phone my parents or, hey, even take a photo of the boyfriend being there and that would be that. But I just didn't have those options available to me, and even if I had, this girl was so conniving that she'd probably have found a way around it. But that sort of maltreatment wasn't what scared me. Yeah, it was upsetting, but another danger became more of a priority when I realized that they had trapped the family dog inside the living room with them. I went back downstairs facing my fears and hoping I could at least get Jazz out of the room with them. She was an Australian Shepherd, one of those dogs that's dead shaggy but also looks like someone spilled a can of paint over them or something. I loved her so much and I had to rescue her. So I knock on the living room door, only to get told to go away. I knock again, telling the babysitter that it was important that Jazz had to go outside to have a wee or for her to be taken on a walk so she could do a number 2. Again, she barked at me to go away. I wasn't about to let this happen to my best friend in the world though, so I pushed the door open just in time to see the boyfriend do something frankly unbelievable. So in England, we play cricket, don't we? And the balls are insanely hard. Like, I think they might be even harder than baseballs you Americans play with. Solid cork on the inside with a tough leather binding. People actually died from getting hit on the head with cricket balls. Jazz loved her cricket ball. We tried throwing tennis balls and stuff for her, but I think she just liked that leather smell the cricket ball gave off. Maybe it reminded her of actually chasing an animal or something. I don't know. But either way, I opened the door of the living room to find the boyfriend of the sitter just lashing the cricket ball at Jazz. So hard that when it hit her back leg, she yelped, all high-pitched. I tried to run in to rescue her, to pull her into my room where she could be safe, but the boyfriend was fast. He pushed me back into the hallway, shut the door, and then I'm certain he wedged something against it, because I couldn't open it at all from then on. I went up to my room and cried myself to sleep, only waking up to hear my parents talking to the sitter when they got home. I didn't make a sound. I was just too scared. For some reason, I had it in my head that the boyfriend would hurt them. I don't know. Kids are daft like that, I suppose, but of course, he wasn't there. He left before my mom and dad got home. I think the real nightmare was that the sitter had actually spun some pure sob story about how I'd been really bad and terribly behaved all evening, how I'd been a brat and demanded this, that, and the other, and they made a huge bloody mistake. The absolute wankers, because that cricket ball had left a huge welt on Jazz's hind leg, and when my dad found out that, I'd at least been partially telling the truth about what they'd been up to. And God, you should have seen how livid he was. I won't bore you with the petty details, but let's just say that sitter and her boyfriend ended up actually getting arrested on animal cruelty charges, and I know for a fact that he ended up getting convicted and fined for it. So, I suppose a silver lining to a truly terrible night, but be careful who you're hiring to sit your kids, people.